Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the birth of Samuel as we begin a study of 1 Samuel. But first we need to begin with an overview just of these two books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, which are really composed as one continuous book. It's split up for convenience sake, probably because the scroll would have been a bit too long. 1 Samuel is going to be really the story of the rise and fall of Saul, although we won't read about Saul until we get to chapter 8. And then 2 Samuel is going to be the rise and fall of King David. 1 Samuel, we're actually going to start with the story of Samuel himself. We'll see the Ark of the Covenant featured prominently in this section of the story. Next, we'll see the story of Saul, the rise of Saul, and how he becomes king and how that goes for a time. And then finally, we'll see David, where Saul is still king during this period, but we're going to see David, and he'll specifically be seen as David the fugitive. Then as we get into 2 Samuel, right at the end of 1 Samuel, we'll see the death of Saul. 2 Samuel, we'll see David as king in the first 10 chapters. In chapters 11 through 20, he'll still be king, but we're going to be focusing upon David's family troubles, and they will be considerable. And finally, we get to the last section, chapters 21 through 24. There will be a collection of stories about David and about his mighty men. So we could actually call that sort of the epilogue of the book. It's fun to take a note of what New Testament books might correlate with these books of Samuel. I'm going to suggest that there's a correlation between Samuel and the Gospel of Luke. In 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1 Samuel begins with the story of the birth of Samuel. In Luke, the story begins with the birth of Jesus, but really John the Baptist as the forerunner of Jesus. It's his birth as well. In Samuel, 1 Samuel begins and 2 Samuel ends at the tabernacle. We have the tabernacle in the beginning, and what will eventually be the temple at the end of 2 Samuel. Likewise, the Gospel of Luke begins and ends at the temple. In Samuel, in 2 Samuel in particular, Nathan is going to tell David a very long parable, one of the longer parables that we have in the historical books. And, of course, Luke is the gospel of the long parables. Luke has several of these long parables that are given in the second section of the Gospel of Luke. In Samuel, we have a long Jerusalem narrative. In fact, there's going to be a section where David has to leave Jerusalem, and you could have told that story just in one verse, but instead it's going to draw it out step by step. We're going to see David departing from Jerusalem during that family crisis section of 2 Samuel. In Luke, there's a section where Jesus sets his face to go toward Jerusalem, and the whole latter half of the book, he's getting closer and closer and closer to Jerusalem. So there's a Jerusalem emphasis in both of these books. And so we begin, chapter 1, verse 1. Now there was a certain man from Ramathaim, Zophim, from the hill country of Ephraim, that's central Israel, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, and she's going to be the focus of this first chapter. And the name of the other was Peninnah, and Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And already that reminds me of a number of stories from the Old Testament that we've already seen up to this point. The story of Sarah, who was barren, the story of Rebecca for a time was barren, the story of Rachel, who was also married to, of course you had Leah and Rachel, the sisters who were married to Jacob, and Rachel for a time was barren. And here's Hannah, also barren, and that was considered to be a great disgrace. Now, we look at this story, and again, there's a similarity to a story that's just earlier in the book of Judges, Judges chapter 13, with the Samson narrative. That had started off, there was a certain man of Zoa of the family of Danites. Notice this story has started off likewise. It's part of the same formula, where there was a certain man from Ramathaim, Zophim from the hill country of Ephraim. So a certain man and the tribe that which he's from, and then his name, whose name was Manoah, whose name was Elkanah, and in Judges, and his wife was barren and had borne no children. And now in 1 Samuel 1 verse 2, and Hannah had no children. So it's going to remind us also of the story of Samson, and there will be some interesting parallels between the story of Samson and the story of Samuel. They will both be great men before the Lord, and they will both be dedicated to the Lord from the time of their birth. Verse 3, now, right now the focus is upon this man Elkanah. Now this man would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. Shiloh was the place where the tabernacle was located. And we read in the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, we're going to get to know them later on, were priests to the Lord there. And so here we're brought to this place Shiloh, where the tabernacle had been, and the tabernacle had been there now for a very long time. So long that it had become a permanent fixture. We're actually going to refer to it as a temple. Reminds me of these mobile home parks that are full of mobile homes, but because they're mobile home parks, the mobile homes aren't mobile anymore. They don't go anywhere. And the tabernacle, which originally had been a portable tent, is now like that. It doesn't travel any longer. Verse 4, when the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and her daughters, but to Hannah he would give a double portion. There were no children that she had to give to, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. And so it emphasizes again this womb closure, this barrenness, which was a great disgrace to her. Verse 6, and to make matters worse, her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. There's jealousy. Whenever you have two wives, you're going to have issues. And so there's jealousy between the two and provocation that takes place. Verse 7, it happened year after year, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her, so she wept and would not eat. Verse 8, then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep, and why do you not eat, and why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Again, that phrase is familiar to us. In the book of Ruth, we had the women of the town after the birth of the baby to Ruth. They came to Naomi and they said, for your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to this new child. Well, Hannah hadn't had any children, and so she's weeping, even though her husband loves her. Notice, am I not better to you than 10 sons? Verse 9, then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat by the doorposts of the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. So you have Eli, business as usual. He's at the temple, at the tabernacle. Hannah comes. It's not business as usual. She's in great distress, and she is praying. Verse 11, she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. Remember, that sounds very much like the Samson story, where the razor would not be upon his head, and she is promising that her son would follow in those sort of footsteps. Verse 12, now it came about, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Anna, she was speaking in her heart. Only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. And so Eli comes to a conclusion. You see, praying quietly was not a custom back in those days. As far as I can tell, this is the only reference in the entire Bible to anyone ever praying quietly. You would speak out your prayer to the Lord. Sometimes maybe loud, sometimes softly, but you would speak out to the Lord. And so Eli comes to a conclusion. He thought she was drunk. She doesn't know what to say. She's, had one too many. And he jumps to a wrong conclusion about her. Verse 14, then Eli, and he acts on that. That's even worse. Then Eli said to her, how long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. Verse 15, but Hannah replied, no, my lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul. Notice, instead of pouring out spirits, she has poured out her soul before the Lord. She says, do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation. She is bringing him up to speed. Verse 17, then Eli answered and said, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him. And she, for her part, takes this as a word from the Lord. She said, let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went away and ate, and her face was no longer sad. She makes an assumption that God has heard because God's priest has heard and has spoken a blessing to her. Verse 19, then they arose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord and returned again to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. Verse 20, and it came about in due time after Hannah had conceived that she gave birth to a son. And there's going to be a play on words here. And she named him Samuel, because I have sha'aled, I have asked him from the Lord. Now, if you look in most commentaries, they'll tell you that Samuel means heard, God has heard me, or something like along those lines. And I get that, but I want you to see that right here in the wording, there's a play on the words, where she named him Samuel because she says, I have sa'eled him and of the Lord, and of course God has heard. So that's in there as well. Verse 21, then the man Elkanah went up with all his household to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. Verse 22, but Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child is weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever. So she is going to stay back with the child until the child is of an age where he's ready to not be with his mother. He's weaned, and of course that might happen a bit later in those days than it would happen with us today. Verse 23, Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you, remain until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord confirm his word. And so the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him, until he's no longer I guess you'd call it a breast baby. Verse 24, now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with a 3-year-old bull and 1 ephah of flour and a jug of wine. This speaks to the fact that they are a well-to-do family. Not every family would have a 3-year-old bull so that they can sacrifice, and so she does. And she brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, although the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli. Verse 26, she said, O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. It's been several years now. Verse 27, for this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition, which I asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord, and he worshipped the Lord there. And so this turns into a story. It's a story of God giving a child, but it turns into a story of worship. And so the opening story is one in which God is honored, God has provided, and God is worshipped. There is a delightful contrast in this story when we compare it to the opening story of Luke chapter 1, in particular Elizabeth's story. Here we have Hannah, she's barren, and of course Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1, she was barren as well. In Hannah's story, she was seen by the priest at the temple. In Elizabeth's story, Elizabeth was married to the priest. Her husband was a priest at the temple. In Hannah's story, Eli initially misinterpreted the actions of Hannah. Remember, he thought that she was drunk. In Elizabeth's story, Zacharias, her husband, did not initially believe the angel's message. He hears this promise that he's going to have a son. He says, yeah, right. In Hannah's story and in Elizabeth's story, the barren becomes fruitful and God provides.